Welcome once again to Economic Forum, where we discuss various issues affecting our economy. And today we would like to discuss the environment. It is common knowledge that nowadays we are destroying the environment, as can be seen by what is happening in the extractive industry, what is happening to our rivers, and other forms of nature. And it is with that in mind that we've invited Dr. Yemi Katerere, an environmentalist and a scholar in that area. Dr. Katerere, welcome to Economic Forum.
John, thank you so much. It's a pleasure being a guest on your program.
Yes. You proffer that biodiversity is the foundation of local and national economies. What do you mean by that?
Of course, when we talk about biodiversity and we talk of a biodiversity economy, people will ask, what is biodiversity? So really, biodiversity is the variability or the variety of organisms, be they from the landmass, what we call terrestrial biodiversity, be it marine biodiversity, or it can be freshwater biodiversity. So that is the biodiversity. It's this amalgamation of all these species, living organisms. Mm-hmm. Now, these organisms that we call biodiversity deliver services through what we call ecosystem services. Mm-hmm. So things like, for example, food that we harvest in the wild. That is a service that is being provided. Things like soil protection. That is an ecosystem service. Things like regulation of water in the catchment areas. That is a service that is being provided by these ecosystems. And ecosystems are made up of species. And the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more stable it is. So for example, if you have a storm like Cyclone Idai, and you have an ecosystem that is a monoculture, just one species, it's likely not to be able to withstand that external intervention.
So Dr. Katerere, what you are saying here is that as we harvest, as we utilize nature as the natural resources that we have, we should think about the future. That, when we exploit these resources, they are also going to be exploited in the future. And the tendency is that we are forgetting that.
We're forgetting that. I mean, give you some examples. Let's take pollination services. Bees, bats, birds provide pollination for up to 30% of the food crops that are grown in the world. So try to imagine that those pollinators disappear because of the destruction of habitat through different activities. So that is one real example that we don't think about our behaviors. So it's really important in that when we talk about economic development, we look about how are we doing this economic development. And we realize that when we talk about a biodiversity economy, it's not a choosing between development and no development. We need development, but we also need the biodiversity. It's a question of what is the type of development that we are pursuing and how sustainable it is.
Maybe at this point, Dr. Katerere, you can just give us a picture of a biodiversity economy and how we are utilizing it in Zimbabwe.
So if we look at, what are the services that we are getting from biodiversity? So we have what we call provisioning services. These provisioning services would be the things, like we said, water regulation, food that we get, building materials that we get from harvesting from the forest, wood for energy. If you look at most of the African continent, access to electricity is very low. It's about 45%. So most of the people are dependent on biomass energy for cooking and heating. So those are the provisioning services that we get from biodiversity. But we also get cultural services. You go out and you want to enjoy the environment, or it could be a spiritual thing. You go to a grove that is a holy grove, and you go there to worship. So those are other values. They don't have a dollar value on them, but those are other values, that we get. So some of them you can put a dollar value on. Some of them don't have a dollar value on them, but they have a use value where you benefit from that. And some of that use can be where you take something like soil, but others are the enjoyment. Going to a national park and you see animals, you see birds and other species, and just knowing that the Victoria Falls is there gives you a level of satisfaction. And those are values of nature.
In fact, with monetary value as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Now, when it comes to some of the natural resources that we are exploiting, what has been your observation regarding the way Zimbabweans are going about it? Are we doing it the right way, or we can do better?
I think Zimbabwe is no different, I think, to other parts of the world. I think that it is very alarming the rate at which we are losing biodiversity. And when I started off, I said the reality is, and the simple truth is, that our lives and our economies are dependent on this biodiversity. And yet we don't seem to realize that. So yes, the bees provide pollination, but the bees don't send you an invoice, right? So, you take it for granted. You go to Victoria Falls, you have to pay $30 to enter. So you put some value on that. But once those bees disappear, you suddenly realize that, wait a minute.
I also had in mind how we use water in urban and now even in rural areas. I also was thinking of the infrastructure that is going on. Lots of buildings going up where we have to dig soils, we have to look for so many materials from nature that we don't replace or that we don't preserve. I think it's something that we have to look into as we look at the development of our economy.
Sure, there are some real threats to biodiversity. One of the biggest threats is climate change. And right now there's COP26 in Glasgow.
Which is now done.
But yes, they're looking at the very issue that we set a target at COP, at the Paris COP. There was a Paris Agreement where we said we would limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees.
Dr. Katerere,
we're not going to achieve that.
We will continue with the threats to biodiversity as we discuss today the environment and especially how biodiversity can contribute to the economic development of the country. We've got Dr. Yemi Katerere, who is an environmentalist as well as a scholar in that area. So join us in the second segment. Welcome to the second segment of Economic Forum, where today we are discussing the environment with the environmental expert and scholar, Dr. Yemi Katerere, who is telling us how important biodiversity is to our national and local economy, and even international economies as well, and has explained in very simple terms some of the things that we should take note of. Now, Dr. Katerere, you were still talking about the threats to biodiversity. You can continue with that.
Okay, so I was saying that one of the biggest threats to biodiversity is climate change. And the speed of climate change is going to affect many species. So those that can migrate and move, they'll move somewhere else. Those that can't, like the forests, they're likely to be affected. So if temperatures are going up and if rainfall is going down, the forests are going to be affected. So the speed at which climate change happens is also an important thing. So that's one. The next most important threat is agriculture. Let's say the food production systems. The food production systems are really complex because you start from land preparation for food production and you use energy. You change the habitat because you remove the natural habitat in order to plant your crops. Then you plant. And in the planting and management, irrigation, you're using other resources. You're pumping water to irrigate, or if it's rain-fed, then it's rain-fed. Then you harvest. Then there's production, there's transportation of the food, there's storage, of the food. And in all those stages, biodiversity is being impacted. Use of chemicals and pollution is affecting biodiversity. So at least 50 to 60% of our natural ecosystems have been affected by agriculture.
But it is the backbone of our economy. And as you explained that, Dr. Katerere, if you could just make sure that it does not discourage the farmer out there. You are with him, you are with her in your description and your definitions.
Absolutely, and we need to eat.
Yes.
But the question is, how do we produce the food? Because we cannot undermine the very resources that we need. The soils, they are very important. So we have to maintain the quality of the soils. There are microorganisms in the soils. The water that is being pumped into these fields. Within the freshwater systems, there are other biodiversity, there are fish and other things. So we have to think about the interconnectedness of the system.
What we are saying here, Dr. Katerere, is that it is important to understand all these processes as we produce our food so that we can also appreciate measures to restore some of these natural resources.
No, absolutely. And we have to look at the sustainable use of all resources. Because all these things are connected. Let's take an example of health and the pandemic that we are going through. These pandemics happen when people get closer and closer to nature. And we get closer and closer to nature because we destroy the habitats. So we have to look at all those things. So everything we do in one component of the ecosystem affects some other component. So you use energy, it's going to affect something. You use chemicals, you're going to have pollution. So you need to understand the interrelatedness of this system. But also we need to change our consumption patterns and our habitat. We can't continue to do things the way we've always done them. We have to change. And I think that is really important. How we relate to nature, how we use nature. The population has been increasing. So things that we could do 50 years ago, 100 years ago, are going to be very different today. The cities are good.
Talk about 50 years ago and 100 years ago. I think our elders, our ancestors, had ways of also preserving the environment during their time. And what you are saying is that we also have to do the same. Are we really doing that maybe through regulation or through education?
There is a bit of it. If you look at the example that you're giving of 50 years, 100 years ago. Now, at that time, people understand how the natural systems work. The populations were much smaller, but there's a lot of traditional knowledge, local knowledge that has been passed on. They understand, local people understand the complexity because they live with nature, they live with biodiversity. They understand the complexity of these systems. So we really need to engage them. We really need to understand their knowledge. And we need to bring together formal science and traditional knowledge. Because through that, we can actually come up with powerful solutions. How have they coped in times of drought? What are the safety nets that they have used in nature? So going to harvest from the wild, where there's baobab fruits and things like that during drought periods. So that knowledge, we need to harvest it from the local communities that understand this. And so we need to strengthen these local communities. We need to invest more at the local level. And we need to start to build from the bottom up. It's not just a top-down economy where it's driven from the center, but we need to understand and say, how do we build up from the bottom? And I think that is very important.
What lessons do we learn from those countries that do not have as enormous amount of nature as we have? They live in deserts, they live in small islands and so forth, but they have everything that they want because of conservation and also tapping from other economies and so forth. Any lessons to be learned from them?
I think context is the biggest lesson, because whatever interventions we do, they have to be informed by context. So if you're living in the desert, the way you value water is very different from somebody living in the Amazon.
Yes.
Right? Because your reality, you know that every drop, counts. So I think that the solutions that we come up have to speak to the local context. The African continent is the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. And with urbanization comes a whole lot of other issues. So for example, infrastructure development. So you need more housing. And when you have more housing, you need more energy. You need to get power to the people that are living there. You need roads for people to move about, to connect the cities with each other. So you need infrastructure, pipes to move water and those kinds of issues. So those things also, you put a pressure on where does food come from as the cities grow? Where does your water come from? And when you have a country like Zimbabwe that is drought prone, and where you don't manage your water resources professionally, then you end up with situations like we have in our urban areas where there is no water that is being piped to residents within the city. So then they rely on underground water. So we are affecting an underground ecosystem by pumping this water in an unsustainable manner.
Dr. Katerere, I'll stop you there. That's Dr. Yemi Katerere, our guest on Economic Forum today, where we are discussing the environment, diversity, and all things related. Join us in the third and final segment of this program. Welcome to the third and final segment of Economic Forum, where today we are discussing the environment, issues to do with biodiversity, and others that are related. And we've invited Dr. Yemi Katerere, who has been explaining some of these things so that we understand how to preserve the environment. And now, Dr. Katerere, the issue of the gross domestic product and equity, the way we measure how well we are doing as countries at times conflicts with how we are preserving our environment, and it's something that is dear to you. What worries you in the type of measurements that we do for our GDP?
So the gross domestic product measurement, GDP, is a very common and it's a very useful way of communicating a sense of how a country is doing. But the thing about the GDP measurement, it doesn't actually tell us the quality of that growth. Right? At what cost is that growth being achieved with respect to biodiversity, and the environment? And in terms of equity, what is the quality of that growth? How are the benefits being distributed? So I think that we need to maybe come up with other ways of communicating how well our economy is doing. So one idea that has been tossed around is looking at what we're calling inclusive wealth. Right? So it's beginning to look at, there are limits to what we can take from the environment before it collapses. So inclusive wealth, number one, recognizes the limits, what they call the planetary limit. Or your behavior, how you behave is going to affect me. So if you are living upstream, you're cutting the trees, then the flow of water is going to be affected to the people going downstream. So you need to be held accountable for your behavior upstream. You need to behave in a way that you take into account that you are impacting other people that rely on this resource.
Are we behaving well as Zimbabweans, considering our wetlands, stream bank cultivation, and so forth?
Yeah. I think it's a mixed bag. I think this. What we are discussing, a lot of it is not new, but it's really about implementation. How do we actually move from realizing that this is the problem or the challenge and this is where we want to be going? And how do we get there? And really engaging. And I think that for me, the issue of agency, giving power to the citizens, localizing interventions. So if we look at, you're talking about stream bank cultivation and so on, how can we get to the local jurisdiction? How do we mobilize and animate local jurisdictions? And I think that the issue of accountability and the laws that we have, I think then help to ensure that we can we're all held accountable at the end of the day.
Yes, the issue about the National Development Strategy 1 that the government has embarked on, it's something that you are involved in your research that you are also part of, where you are researching the Zimbabwe biodiversity economy. Can you tell us about this study that you are carrying out and probably what it is going to benefit Zimbabwe?
Okay. So I think this is really an exciting study because the government, through the Minister of Environment and Minister of Finance, they suddenly realized that this biodiversity is actually much more important to our economy than we are giving credit to it. And so they said, let's launch this study that looks at, number one, what is the status of biodiversity in our country? What are the trends? Where are we losing the biodiversity? If you look at deforestation, we are losing 300,000 hectares of forests, in a year. So where is this? Where is the biodiversity? Where is it happening? And the trends, where are we losing most of our biodiversity? Through what? And those kinds of things. So really giving us a context at the national level that this is the status of biodiversity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, where are the economic opportunities? Because that's now your biodiversity economy, where you're now starting to look at what are the economic activities at the national level that that contribute to economic outcomes, job creation, commercialization, as well as contributing to the conservation of that biodiversity. Because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that our activities can contribute to human well-being, whilst also at the same time ensuring that we are not destroying the very foundation of our economies. So where are the economic opportunities for this? So that's the second thing. The third thing is going to look at, how do we account for this biodiversity in our national accounts? So we can talk about, maize and how many tons we've produced and, our granaries and so on, but we don't have the same emphasis when it comes to biodiversity. When we talk about the contribution of tobacco to the GDP, right? 1 billion a year. But the treatment, the curing of that tobacco is using indigenous forests. And that is a huge cost to this country, and yet it's not factored when we talk about the $1 billion we earn. That $1 billion includes the loss of very vital...
So the study would also come up with recommendation of activities that are sustainable, for actually alternatives that are sustainable.
Exactly. But we need to be clear, this is the beginning, and I think it's commendable that the government recognizes the importance of biodiversity and decides that we need to have a study as a starting point. But coming up with a Zimbabwe biodiversity economy study is not going to be the panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems that that we face. But it's a very good start. And I think it can also contribute to, number one, breaking down the silos. We can't plan as Minister of Energy, Minister of Agriculture. We have to break down these silos because these systems are all interrelated. We cannot stop the loss of biodiversity without engaging the agricultural sector because of its impact. And the impacts, the loss of biodiversity is from outside forces. And we need to understand what are those external forces, what are those threats to the biodiversity. So I think it will raise awareness. So when this was launched in June of 2021, inception meeting was held end of September, but we had, the Auditor General was there, Zimstats was there, the Reserve Bank was there participating. The sectors, Zimpas, Forestry Commission, Zinwa, they were all there because of the importance of this study.
Which is very important, to include all these stakeholders. Exactly. And the participants. Well, with that, Dr. Katerere, I would like to thank you very much for coming on to Economic Forum, where we discussed various issues affecting our environment and some of the studies that you are carrying out with government as one of our renowned scholars in that area. So thank you very much for coming to Economic Forum.
Thank you so much, John, for having me on the program.
Yes. That was Dr. Yemi Katerere, who is an environmental expert as well as a scholar, who had come to discuss with us about the environment. So until next time here on Economic Forum, please don't forget to get in touch with us on the numbers that are flashing on your screen so that we can answer some of your questions or even deal with some of the issues that you feel that we have not covered. So until then, this is John Masow.